Ever feel like people just don't get you? Like they're judging you based on like a surface glance?
Yeah, we've all been there.
Well, that's what we're going to dive into today. The story of a queen history kind of remembers as, well, the she-wolf, Isabella of France.
The she-wolf, huh? Definitely sounds like a judgment call, right?
It does, doesn't it? Makes you think of like a cruel woman. But what if there's way more to her story?
Exactly, and that's what we're going to explore, right? Using this Noble Blood podcast episode, they did one all about Isabella.
Yeah, from, her marriage to King Edward II, all the way to like her role in his downfall. And oh man, you won't believe the twists and turns.
Buckle up, it's a wild ride.
Seriously. So much of Isabella's story starts with this power imbalance, something I think we can all relate to a little, even all these centuries later.
Oh, absolutely. Like, just imagine, you're a young princess, basically a pawn in this, like, high-stakes Game of Thrones, right?
Exactly. That's Isabella. She was just 7 years old when they basically, promised her to this future king, Edward II of England.
Wow. 7.
7. Totally a strategic move by her dad, the King of France, to kind of solidify his own power.
Makes sense, like a classic power play, right?
Totally. But it gets even crazier. It wasn't just, okay, you're engaged. They shipped her off to England to be raised in the English court.
Away from her family and everything she knew. That's harsh.
It was all about, like, making her assimilate,
Mm-hmm.
turning her into the perfect English queen.
So she'd be loyal to her husband no matter what.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Edward wasn't exactly, waiting with open arms.
Oh, I bet.
The podcast really paints this picture of him, just completely ignoring Isabella, even after they were officially married. And she was just 12 at that point. He was already king.
12.
12.
Oh, my goodness.
And it wasn't just like teenage awkwardness. Edward, well, he had this very public preference for, let's just say, male companions.
Right.
And his relationship with this guy, Piers Gaveston, his favorite, caused a huge scandal from the second Isabella set foot in England.
I can only imagine.
The descriptions, they're almost hard to hear. Yep. Edward just showering Gaveston with attention, gifts, everything. He even gave him a super prominent role at the coronation. Let him wear purple.
Purple.
The color reserved for royalty. Total slap in the face to everyone, especially the English barons.
Yeah.
And a total humiliation for Isabella.
Like, how could she not feel completely sidelined?
Right. A young queen in a foreign country expected to, like, produce heirs and solidify her husband's power while he's openly favoring another man.
It's no wonder she felt powerless, completely isolated.
There's this letter she wrote to her dad. It's heartbreaking. She calls herself the most wretched of wives.
Oh, wow.
Gives you a glimpse into, like, what she must have been going through emotionally.
It's just, so important to remember that context. Because Edward's actions weren't just personal. They were a political challenge, too. The barons, they saw Gaveston as a threat to their power, their influence.
Wow.
They hated how much Edward favored him.
So Isabella's stuck in this pressure cooker. It's like a love triangle, but with, the fate of a whole kingdom hanging in the balance.
Total Shakespearean drama.
Totally.
Yeah.
And just like in Shakespeare, there's this huge turning point.
Ooh, tell me.
The barons, finally fed up, they rebel. Force Edward to banish Gaveston.
Wow.
And that's when things actually shift a little between Isabella and Edward.
Yeah.
Yeah. With Gaveston gone, Edward starts, paying attention to his wife, grants her lands, includes her in his travels, even writes her letters when they're apart.
It's like a honeymoon phase almost, after a really, really rough start.
The podcast mentions they'd even gamble together, like as a team.
Interesting.
It shows, some level of companionship, maybe even a little affection. Who knows?
Yeah, you start to see this, like, more human side of their relationship.
Right. It's easy to think of these historical figures as, like, characters in the book, but they were real people with all the messy emotions and motivations.
Totally. And knowing that makes what happens next even more tragic. Because Edward's pattern, well, it didn't end with Gaveston.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. Enter Hugh Despenser.
Uh-oh. This doesn't sound good.
It's not. Despenser was, to put it lightly, ambitious, cruel, and manipulative. Like, the podcast calls him a shadow king, whispering in Edward's ear, turning him against Isabella.
Oh, wow. He sounds like a straight-up villain.
Pretty much. And his arrival marks a serious downturn. He starts actively working against Isabella, strips her of her lands, her servants, even takes away her younger children.
No way. The betrayal.
It's brutal. Think about it. She goes from queen, even with a difficult marriage, to totally ostracized,
Yeah.
alone in her own court.
So what does she do? How does she respond to that?
Well, she's not one to just sit back and take it.
Hmm.
Isabella gets this chance to go to France in 1325.
Okay.
It was supposed to be, for diplomacy.
Right.
But really, it was her escape hatch.
Yeah.
Away from Edward and Despenser to, plan her comeback.
Smart move. And she doesn't just, hang out in France complaining about Edward.
Yeah.
She's working it, building alliances.
I like her already.
And that's where Roger Mortimer comes in.
Ah, yes, Roger Corrigan.
He was this powerful English baron who also had beef with Edward and Despenser.
Right.
He'd been imprisoned, then escaped to France.
Yeah.
So he had his own reasons for wanting revenge.
Yeah, so they team up.
The podcast called it a collision of ambition and resentment.
I bet.
It's almost poetic,
Yeah.
Isabella finds safety and support right where Edward would least want her in France, her home.
Yeah, exactly.
And together they start plotting this crazy invasion of England.
Wow.
And get this, while she's in France, she starts wearing widow's weeds.
Widow's weeds. But Edward's still alive.
Exactly. It was this super symbolic move.
Yeah.
Widow's weeds were those black mourning clothes women wore back then.
Right.
So she's basically saying, Edward, you're already treating me like a widow. Might as well dress the part.
Oh. Powerful statement.
It was, and it totally worked. She's
Right.
reclaiming her story, using it to rally support against Edward.
So she's not just a vengeful wife anymore.
Not at all. It's in France that she-wolf title takes on a new meaning. She becomes this liberator.
Interesting.
In 1326, they land in England with a small army, and the people are thrilled.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They were so done with Edward and Despenser. They saw Isabella as their savior.
Wow.
It's crazy different from the Norman conquest centuries earlier. William the Conqueror had to fight tooth and nail for the throne.
Right, lots of resistance.
But Isabella, it was almost bloodless.
Seriously?
Towns opened their gates. People switched sides to join her.
That's incredible.
It shows you how well Isabel and Mortimer had turned public opinion against Edward. They painted him as weak, incompetent, controlled by Despenser.
Makes sense.
And then Edward makes things even worse by how he reacts.
What'd he do?
Remember how he ran away with Gaveston when the barons rebelled?
Yeah.
He does the same thing with Despenser, just abandons the kingdom,
Yeah.
leaving Isabella to clean up the mess.
Talk about a pattern.
Right. He learned nothing. It just proved everything Isabella and Mortimer were saying, that he wasn't fit to be king.
It's like he handed her the keys to the kingdom.
Exactly. By running away, he gave up his power. And Isabella becomes the ruler, acting as regent for her son Edward III.
The queen who was ignored and pushed aside is now the most powerful person in England.
Talk about a turnaround.
Yeah.
At this point, things get really interesting. Because now they have to deal with Edward II.
Right, the deposed king.
And this is where that she-wolf label really sticks.
Because she's seen as the one who brought him down.
Exactly. But the podcast makes this point that deposing a king like that through Parliament, it was unheard of back then.
It was a radical move.
Totally, and it changed the monarchy forever.
Right.
And then there's the whole mystery of Edward II's death.
Yeah.
He died in captivity, but no one knows exactly how.
Right.
Some people think Isabella and Mortimer had him killed. But there's no proof. The podcast even brought up this wild theory that Edward actually escaped and lived in secret.
Oh.
Like they killed a look-alike instead.
That's a crazy twist.
I know, right? But, however, he died. Edward's deposition was a major turning point for England.
Yeah. A king being held accountable for his actions. And Parliament having the power to remove him, that's huge.
So Isabella's actions had a massive impact.
Yeah.
But what about her personally? Did she get her happily ever after?
Well, that's where things get a little complicated. Isabella's story takes another unexpected turn.
Oh.
Remember how Edward's obsession with Gaveston and Despenser caused his downfall?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like Isabella didn't learn from that.
You mean she starts playing favorites too?
Yep. With Edward II gone, Roger Mortimer steps in as the most powerful guy in England.
Oh, no.
And just like Edward Isabella showers Mortimer with titles and lands.
Like she's repeating the same mistakes.
It's a sad pattern. And just like with Edward's favorites, the barons start getting resentful. They just got rid of one tyrant. They weren't going to stand for another.
Yeah, even if it was Isabella.
Exactly.
So Isabella's victory is short-lived. She goes from liberator to just another power-hungry ruler.
And to make matters worse, she signs this treaty, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, in 1328.
What did that do?
It basically gave Scotland its independence and promised her daughter in marriage to the Scottish king's son.
She gave away part of England.
Yep.
That didn't go over well.
Not at all. It was seen as a huge betrayal. Her popularity plummeted.
Wow, what a downfall.
She went from beloved queen to the woman who gave away their land.
It's like she won the battle but lost the war.
It happens. Power is fleeting. Even those at the top can fall quickly.
So what happens to Mortimer? And what about Isabella? Does she just fade away?
Well, Isabella's story doesn't end there. Her son, Edward III, he's growing up, right? Seeing all this, his mom's reign, Mortimer grabbing for power. The podcast talks about him, how he was watching everything, learning.
So he's not just gonna, like, sit back and let them run the show.
Exactly. He bides his time, and then in 1330, bam, he stages this coup, gets some key nobles on his side. Mortimer's arrested, accused of treason, executed.
Just like Despenser.
Full circle, right. Mortimer brought Edward II down, and now he gets the same treatment, power and revenge.
It's wild. So Isabella, what happens to her? Her own son just overthrew the guy she put in charge.
Well, he does put her under house arrest for a while, but he doesn't totally abandon her. I mean, she's still his mother.
Right, and he probably gets it on
Mhm.
some level, the impossible position she was in.
Maybe. It's complicated, right? Son takes down mom who took down dad. Hard to imagine all that family drama.
And the podcast doesn't, like, get into Isabella's head too much here. But she does eventually get some freedom back, lives out her days pretty peacefully, even goes to some court events.
So not a fairy tale ending, but not the worst considering everything.
Right, she went from queen to basically running the show to losing it all to her son.
It's a crazy life. It makes you think how we judge these figures from history, especially women.
Yeah, she's called the she-wolf, but she was playing the game she was dealt, in a world where women didn't have a lot of choices.
Absolutely. It's that double standard. A woman's ambitious. She's a threat. She stays quiet. She's ignored. Isabella went for it, and yeah, there were consequences.
It reminds you that history isn't simple. It's not good guys and bad guys. There's so much more to it.
Definitely. To understand it, you got to look at the nuances, the whole picture.
So was Isabella a she-wolf, a clever queen, or somewhere in between? That's up to each of us to decide. Her story makes us think about power, ambition, the choices we make when things are really tough.
Well said.
If you found this deep dive into Isabella of France interesting, there's a bunch of great sources out there. We encourage you to check them out. And of course, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating stories.